So, here are the 5 bonus ways to make sure that your first sermon is memorable and is one that you are proud of. So far we've done 10. And if you've missed the first 10 must have tips about how to prepare a great sermon and to give your first talk, teaching, lesson, live, whatever it is that you're doing. And this goes for those of you who are social media influencers and those of you who want to have a following online on social media. All of the tips that I've given about preparing a sermon or preparing a lesson will work for a social media live or post as well. My name is Pastor Sharo. I'm the pastor of Hope NYC, and Preacher Girl TV is my channel. This is where we talk about all the things that women of God who have a message need to know. So today we're talking about, and these are 5 bonus things that you need to consider when you're starting a new channel, when you're starting a new ministry, introducing yourself to who is going to be your audience, your congregation, or your public. So you've decided to start your own YouTube channel or your own Instagram or Facebook channel, and you are going to provide Christian content to people who need to know the Word of God and just to live a better life, or a life that's more aligned to the life that Jesus wanted us to live. So you want to make sure that what you're talking about and what you're trying to tell people really makes a difference in their lives. And so my 11th tip, and really one of the most important things, is to make sure that your message is not just relevant, but it captures your reader or your listener's attention. So that means you might want to talk about something like, you know, century theology. But you have to ask yourself, do the people that I'm trying to reach, does my demographic, my niche, or the people that I know that would be attracted to what I have to say, do they want to know about second century theology? And the answer is probably no. So the number 11 is knowing who your audience is. That's so important that you pick one demographic specifically. Pick your best friend. We talked about something like this in the first 5, but this is a little bit different. You want to know the general public that you'll be listening to, will be listening to you. So say perhaps you are speaking to a class of 30 people. Then it would be great if you could find out the median age of those people. So say you have 30 women, and most of them have just had their first babies. So they're probably in their late 20s, early 30s, 20s and 30s, that kind of thing. So you want to structure your message to appeal to that demographic of women. So knowing who your audience is, or your choice audience, maybe you have nobody to listen to you yet, but if you provide content that really appeals to those people. So say perhaps you want to start a channel just for social media influencers who want to know how to integrate their Christian faith into their topics, into their podcast, or into their blogs, or into their posts. Then you know that your median age of people are 20 somethings or 30 some early 30 somethings, and so you will provide lifestyle content that matters to that demographic. You're not going to be talking about, BJ Thomas, and you're not going to be talking so much about World War II, because it is kind of far away from where their mind is. But maybe that demographic of people like to know about politics, and they like to know about what's going on in the White House and what's going on with the Palestine versus Israel conflict. And you could bring the scripture into that kind of topic and know that people in their late 20s and 30s want to be informed. What is the Christian perspective on those kinds of issues? People in that age group also want life hacks. How do I juggle a family and a marriage and a job and my faith and all of those things? How do I make money on the side? All of those things are things that people in that age group want to hear. Say perhaps that your demographic are people over 50, right? Who are we speaking to then? You want to cater your message to empty nesters. You're going to talk about when kids go off to college, about, uh, post job activities. Maybe they're getting ready to think about their retirement, or things like that, or a second lease in life, or dating again after a divorce. All of those things might be topics. Oh, how to stop your hair from going gray, or how to learn to live with gray hair and love it from a biblical perspective. So if you can figure out who you're talking to, then you'll be able to really tailor your message to reach those people. When I come to talk to you, I'm not going to talk to you about how to detail your car or how to change your oil, because you might want to know that as a person, but the general public I'm talking to don't really want to know that. We just take our cars to the shop or get the husband to do it, right? So that's why you need to know who you're talking to so that you can make sure that your message appeals to them. The Bible is full of messages that center around, if you think about it, a lot of men. And there are some women in the Bible as well, but not as many women as there are men. But there's enough content in there with the women that we can talk for years. And even the stories that include men are stories that can be tailored to fit a Christian woman. So that's tip number 11. Make sure that your topic is not just interesting to you, but that it's interesting to the people you are catering to, right? It's so important that there's a common thread through all of your presentations. Even though I'm a pastor of a church, there's still a common thread that goes through all of my sermons. There's still a common thread that goes through all of my podcasts. Every podcast that I do is catered towards women with who have a ministry, who have a calling. Even if that calling is not on a pulpit or in front of a camera, there's still a calling in your life. So we want to make sure that that comes out of you, right? And that doesn't matter if you're doing makeup, if you're doing art, if you're selling shoes, it really doesn't matter as long as you know who you're talking to. So know your audience is number 11. Number 12. This one's really good. And I guess a really good analogy is if you've ever been fishing, you go with your pole and you go with your hook and you go with no bait, you're probably going to catch no fish, because bait is a really important part of catching fish. If you just put your hook in the water, the fish are going to go right past you. It's the same thing with your sermon, your message, your video. If there's no hook, if there's no bait on the hook that you're putting, then people are going to go right past you. So I know you've heard probably that every presentation has to have a hook, right? In the first minute, every sermon has to have a hook. But a hook without bait is just a weapon. And you need to remember that you have to put something that's enticing, appealing to the people that you're trying to reach so they don't just get hooked, because people who get hooked feel like they've gotten caught. Nobody wants to be sold. Nobody wants to be caught. We want to be invited. We want to buy. We don't want to be sold. Does that make sense? So put bait on your hook. That means what is in this teaching? What is in this presentation? What is in this sermon for the person who's listening to me? What can they take away? Right? I know maybe those of you want to start a side hustle and you're doing that on social media, but you want to make sure your faith is infused in it. Sometimes you come across as being very preachy or very seller. You're a salesperson. This is what I did. This is how I do it. Don't you like what I did? Like, let me give you a really good, for instance. So I just published a book on dreams, right? It's a workbook, and it's the kind of book that I like, where you wake up in the morning and you had a dream, you have no idea what it means, but it's troubling you. So you get to open this book and you get to fill out all the little details in a fun way about your dream. One of my past podcasts, I think we can link it somewhere here, has that dream journal and how it works. And so I was so excited to get this book out to you guys so that everybody could use it. And I was going to say, hey, look, this is my book. And I wrote this so that you can jot your dreams down, but nobody cares. Nobody wants me to talk about my book and how I think you should get my book. So instead, what I did was say, I had a dream, and this is how I journaled it. I never sold the book. I never asked for anybody to go buy it right now while stocks last. I just told you this is what I did. And then you know what happened? In the comments, people are like, where do I get that journal? What journal is that? How do I get my hands on that? Where did you buy that? Up until that point, I didn't try to sell it to anybody, so nobody was feeling sold. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Because what I'm trying to say is that you have to put bait on your hook. And my bait, or what I put on that hook about a dream journal, is that when you have a great dream, God is probably talking to you. God is saying something to you. And unless you can interpret that dream, you've wasted the voice of God to you. You've wasted God's instruction. You ignored God's voice because you don't have the skills, the equipment, the time, or the memory. So a dream journal will help you record what God is saying, even if at the time you can't interpret it. And then in the dream journal, instead of just writing a whole paragraph about what your dream is and trying to remember all the details, I put spaces there so you can answer the questions that I would ask you as a dream interpreter, right? So these are the things that if you ever got with somebody who hears from the Lord concerning dreams, they would ask you these questions. What was the tone? What was the mood? Who were the characters? What did it remind you of in the Bible? Were there any colors, any specific images? I hope that makes sense. So if you're a mom of toddlers and you have a message, God saying, I want you to reach out to those single moms out there. I want you to help them get equipped to live a life that's exciting and that they don't feel that their life is stuck at home. And this is the people that you're trying to reach. You make sure that every time you do that blog, maybe your blog is 5 meals in 5 minutes. 5 meals in 5 minutes, right? What you would what is the bait that you're going to put on that hook? The bait is, I'm going to show you how to save a bunch of time in the morning so that you could get time for your Bible study, so you could get some self-care time, because everybody knows that that's what those people need. That's what we don't have a lot of. It's extra time. So the bait is, when you listen to this podcast or you hear this message, you're going to be able to save yourself a bunch of time to better take care of you. Number 3, which is number 13 in the whole series, is this: interactive elements. Now, we talked about somewhere between 5 and 10, we talked about props and visuals. An interactive element is different. If you've ever done a master class or you've ever done a Bible study and you were given a worksheet or a handout or something, do you know why that's given? Because when people feel like they're involved in what you're doing, they have a vested interest in what you're teaching. If you give out a free cheat sheet, a free downloadable PDF, I know you're hearing it because people do it all the time. Click here and you get that free download. All of a sudden, you're not just teaching a lesson, preaching a sermon, giving a podcast. All of a sudden, your user, your audience, your listener gets to participate with you. So say perhaps you are the mom doing that 5-minute meals in the morning. What your download would look like was maybe a recipe exchange. So here is my cookbook. It's free of charge for you. And all you have to do is include one recipe to get the download. Guess what's going to happen? If 100 moms send you a recipe that they use, a 5-minute recipe, you would have a book of 500 recipes plus the 10 that you're giving away for free, of 100 recipes plus your 10. So that kind of interaction takes your lesson, your message, your sermon, your social media account to a different level, because people feel connected to you, integrated to you. Now, I have to put a disclaimer right here before I give you the last 2. If you are a social media influencer that's about fashion and makeup, and all you do is to put the spotlight on yourself, this is what I wore today, this is what I'm wearing this evening, this is what I'm wearing tomorrow, then these tips are probably not going to work for you. All of these tips pertain basically to people who have a speaking ministry, who have something to say, right? Not just pictures, not just fashion, but if you're doing fashion, maybe it's fashion that's modest, you have something to say. I'm teaching you how to say it well, how to say it in a way that engages people and make sure that people will never forget it. This is your first one, so this is how you get people to keep coming back. First episode, interact with them. Say something like, tell me what you want to hear on this podcast. Put a survey out there. Yes or no questions on your Instagram reel. It doesn't matter, but if you get somebody involved, even if it's one person or 5 people, it's going to make a big difference, right? Number 4, build a strong conclusion, right? I have heard so many fantastic messages just bomb at the end. So I have this one friend, and she is great. She always has a word from the Lord. So the first time I asked her to present a sermon, a message, she went up there and it was amazing. It was powerful. She was just preaching. This was her first sermon ever. I was shocked. I was like, good night. She's going to have my job. She's so good. And then it was time for the conclusion of the sermon. And she turned the page for the book. And we all held our breath in anticipation as we watched her. And then she said, The end. And she closed the book and she ran off the stage and she ran away and started crying and locked herself in a room forever, for a long time. It took me hours to get her out of the room. And when I knocked on the door after a long time, she was crying and I said, "What's wrong?" And she's like, "There was nothing there." And I was thinking, well, if you didn't write anything, of course there was nothing there. It was almost as if she was turning the page to see if something magically appeared there. It was a great sermon with no conclusion. It's kind of like you getting on an airplane and have a great ride, but you never land. So, as important as the introduction to your first social media podcast, so to your first sermon, lesson, whatever it is, the conclusion is just as maybe even more important. Always look at your conclusion as a reward to the person who has sat through the torture of listening to you, right? If you make it to number 5, you are my favorite people because you'll listen to me go on from beginning to end. Don't leave your audience hanging. Don't underwhelm, right? Do you know what a climax is? Okay, you take it anywhere you want it, the context will work. Climax is a really great ending to a really good story. And every sermon has to build up to the point where the end is amazing. Always anticipate the message that you want people to leave with. Let that be the last thing you say. That's not just repeating the headline, but that is taking all the strings that you've talked about, the 11, 12, 13, 14, and putting it in a big bundle in number 15. The conclusion has to stick it. It's the landing of the gymnastics routine. It's the punchline of the joke. It is number 10, the big one, right? So, in everything in life, nobody wants to work real hard with no reward. Even in everything. Think about it. Everything has to come to a climax that is worth the work. And so in a message, it's the same thing. So the way I do it is like I always say if my people are driving home after church and their daughter or son asks them, "What was the sermon about today?" I want that parent to be able to give an answer in one sentence, right? So yesterday I preached about love and marriage, and so the anybody in the car who heard the message would be able to say, "Pastor Sharo talked about love and marriage," right? And maybe their takeaway is that a husband is anointed to heal his wife, and a wife is anointed to heal her husband. Maybe that. But that's what a conclusion has to look like. You make sure that the person leaves feeling like the ends are tied up. And unless it's a sermon series that you want people with a cliffhanger, even a cliffhanger is a good ending. But it must be an intentional conclusion. An intentional conclusion. The temptation is to make sure the content is really good and just let the ending find itself. Don't do it. I've done it. It's a bad idea. I've preached great sermons and didn't land the plane properly. Have you ever been on one of those flights where, it's been smooth the whole way, but the pilot obviously doesn't know how to land this plane and you're like, that's anxiety for all of us. And it's the same thing watching the train wreck of a sermon come to an end, right? So you want to make sure that you pay attention to your conclusion. You make sure you want to leave your crowd going, yes, or weeping or repenting or saying, "I can't wait for next week." You know why some shows last 11 seasons? You know why? Because the ending is so crazy that you can't wait for the next week. Those are very intentional. That last minute of your show, those writers thought about it a lot. You can't just leave it to chance, okay? So work on that conclusion, work on your ending just as much as you work on your introduction and on your content. And the last suggestion, number 5, and the end of our podcast and this series on how to how to prepare and deliver your first impactful message online. And it's important because at Preacher Girl, we believe that you don't need a pulpit. You just need a message. And that's why I'm teaching you how to properly get that message out. The last thing is be prepared to answer questions. I think that if you want to be an authority on something, even if you're not pretending to be professional at it, right? You're just like, look, I'm a girl just like you, trying to do my thing out here for the name of Jesus, just like you. I don't know all the answers, but I'm still prepared to hear your questions, especially when you're a pastor or you're in social media. Not everybody's going to like you. In fact, it's unfair, but you get a lot more dislikes than you do likes. And most of all, a lot of times you have to just learn to ignore the negative comments that you hear on places like TikTok and Instagram. And however, if a question is a valid question, even if it's not one that makes you comfortable, don't ignore it. Take it and use it. Here why. If one person has the guts to ask you, somebody else is also thinking it. Somebody else is also inquiring, right? So be prepared to answer questions without getting offended, without feeling threatened and intimidated, without feeling like I'm going to just shut them down and block them right now, right? I know churches where you can't ask the pastor to clarify something. You can't disagree or say, show me that in the word, because they'll get angry. But I've never gotten angry for that, because I want to hear what people are thinking. I want to know that you didn't get that clearly and you want some extrapolation or you want some clarification on what it is I said and meant. It makes me know that, one, you were listening, and makes me know that I could give clarity to more people than just you. Now, this applies to whether you're doing a podcast on makeup, on fashion, on biblical studies, on women of the Bible, on hair. It doesn't matter. When somebody says something like, "Wait a minute, where did all your gray hair go?" Stop and answer the question, right? And for God's sake, don't lie. If you're wearing weave, say, "I got weave." If you got no weave, say, "I got no weave." It's like when Michael Jackson said he had vitiligo and everybody knew. You might have had it, but not all of that was vernacular. You know what I'm saying? It kind of leaves a bad taste in your audience's mouth. You want to be sure that people see your authentic self, and that you are, if you're presenting truth, that is. If your persona is fake, then by all means, say whatever you want. But if it's a message, if it's the message of the kingdom that you're trying to get out there, then try your best to do it authentically and honestly, and have room for questions and answers. And so, Preacher Girls, that's my last 5 tips on how to prepare a ridiculously great and memorable sermon, message, teaching, presentation, podcast, whatever it is you're doing. Get the message out there. It is your responsibility. Jesus is coming soon, and he's going to ask you, what did you do with what he invested in you? And don't you ever forget, if God called you, nobody can uncall you.